First of all, I'd like to thank everybody who has organized this conference and to say that I'm very humbled and very honored to be speaking here today. The title of my paper is Incarceration Incorporated, and I'll begin now. Like Jim Crow and slavery, mass incarceration operates as a tightly networked system of laws, policies, customs, and institutions that operate collectively to ensure the subordinate status of a group defined largely by race. According to Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, mass incarceration refers to the ballooning of the prisoner population of the United States, which has soared from 300,000 in 1972 to over 2.3 million in 2012, more than any other nation in the world. She refers to the black population of the United States as a subordinated race, which constitutes only 7% of the total population, but a disproportionate 33% of the population incarcerated or under criminal justice supervision. These developments are directly traceable to the current drug war initiated by President Ronald Reagan in 1982, as well as the large-scale move in the U.S. towards prison privatization during the same era. Under the neoliberal shift towards prison privatization, wherein the private sector owns and operates prisons throughout the country, advocates claimed that private corporations would be more efficient than government in running prisons, and that by relieving the government of these affairs, the state would cut costs. However, private corporations are compelled to make and increase profits. And in the case of private prisons, this is operationalized by increasing the prisoner population. The result has been the rise of the prison industrial complex, which today is dominated by two large publicly traded corporations, the Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, and the GEO Group, who together control 75% of the industry. This paper will illustrate how the United States' drug war and its shift towards prison privatization, which has led to the subsequent rise of the prison industrial complex, has had a nefarious and racist societal outcome, resulting in an unnecessary and unjustified increase in the number of its prisoners, with a disproportionate number of those incarcerated being black. This will be achieved by analyzing the early stages of the drug war and the shift to for-profit prisons, the presence of racism in this relatively recent phenomenon, the wealth and influence of the prison industrial complex, and finally how all these factors have led to an erosion of democratic values. For most of the 20th century leading up to the 1970s, the prisoner population of the US had been relatively stable, ranging between 100,000 and 200,000 inmates. As mentioned above, in 1972, that number grew to 300,000, which then grew to 1 million in 1990 and to over 2.3 million in 2012. The United States today imprisons more of its citizens than any other society in human history, 500,000 more than China, a country with a population that is 5 times greater. With only 5% of the global population, the US holds 25% of the world's prisoner population. With the dramatic increase in the number of people incarcerated, one might draw the conclusion that crime in general, and violent crime in particular, have soared in the country over the same time period. However, crime rates in the country have not been noticeably higher than those of other Western nations, and between 1960 and 1990, the official crime rates in the US, Finland, and Germany were virtually identical. Yet the different approaches to the punishment of crime led to a quadrupling of the incarceration rate in the US, while it fell by 60% in Finland and remained stable in Germany. Currently, crime rates in the United States have declined below the international average, but the number of people imprisoned is 6 to 10 times greater than in any other industrialized country. Significantly, when the current war on drugs began, illegal drug use was on the decline. But during the course of the next few decades, arrests and convictions for drug offenses in the country rose dramatically, especially among African Americans. Today, 97% of the 125,000 federal prisoners and 2/3 of the 1 million state prisoners have been convicted of nonviolent offenses, while 16% of those incarcerated suffer from mental illness. The dramatic increase in the incarcerated population of the US over the last 3 decades is unjustified and does not represent a similar increase in the amount of crimes committed. This begs the question, why are the number of prisoners in general and the number of black prisoners in particular so disproportionately high? In October of 1982, President Ronald Reagan officially announced his administration's war on drugs at a time when less than 2% of the citizenry viewed drugs as the nation's most important issue. According to Alexander, the lack of public support for the drug war from the outset had little to do with public concern about drugs and much to do with public concern about race. Almost immediately thereafter, the budgets of federal law enforcement agencies skyrocketed. An economic downturn during the era hit many African Americans, with the 1970s and 1980s rendering a pronounced increase in unemployment as urban blue-collar factory jobs decreased sharply due to globalization, deindustrialization, and the outsourcing of low-skilled manufacturing jobs to other countries. While more than 70% of all African Americans working in metropolitan areas held blue-collar jobs in 1970, that number dropped to 28% in 1987. The lack of employment opportunities within urban areas incentivized the selling of drugs, the most common of which became crack cocaine. Crack appeared on the streets in 1985, 3 years after Reagan's drug war was announced. It is pharmacologically almost identical to powder cocaine, but is consumed differently and produces a faster, shorter, stronger high, using less of the drug at a more affordable price. Tough on crime became a winning slogan for politicians, and numerous such legislations were passed, resulting in drastic increases in the number of those incarcerated. The impact was felt especially amongst blacks, devastating black neighborhoods. While the war on drugs and the privatization of prisons have been marketed in race-neutral and colorblind language, there is no doubt that the primary targets of these two movements have been African Americans. Today, 1 in 9 black males in the United States between the ages of 20 and 34 are behind bars. And 3 out of every 4 in the District of Columbia, and nearly all who live in its poorest neighborhoods, can expect to serve time behind bars at some point in their lives. The heavy investments in the prison industrial complex over the last 3 decades has been accompanied by similar disinvestments in social welfare programs, including higher education, which benefited the poor. And because a disproportionately high number of the poor in the US are black, they have been subjected to the majority of the adverse effects. Between 1984 and 2000, the state spending on prisons was 6 times the increase of spending on higher education across every state in the country, as well as the District of Columbia. While Illinois' budget for higher education increased by 30% between 1985 and 2000, their budget for corrections increased by more than 100%. And while they have since 1985 built over 20 new prisons, work camps, or other detention facilities, they have built no new institutions of public higher education. The result has been devastating. There are now more blacks under the supervision of the US criminal justice system than those enrolled in colleges or universities. Furthermore, to house the increasing number of those incarcerated between the years 2000 and 2005, a new prison was built in the US every 12 days. Finally, and perhaps most damning, today the United States of America imprisons more black people than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. Are black people really so much more prone to drug crime than their white counterparts in the United States? And is the staggering number of incarcerated African Americans justified? The answer to both questions is simply no. A study by the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, of marijuana arrests between 2001 and 2010 found that in every state and community in the United States, while marijuana use is identical between blacks and whites, blacks are arrested on average 3.73 times more than whites, with this rate rising in some places to 5, 10, 15, even 20. Today, almost half of all drug arrests in the country involve marijuana, a drug less harmful than cigarettes and alcohol. And in 2010 alone, the US arrested 784,021 people for marijuana possession. A recent study by the Brookings Institute found that black Americans are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested for selling drugs than their white counterparts, and 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for possessing them. Furthermore, in 1980, before the beginning of Reagan's drug war, whites were about 45% more likely to sell drugs than black, and today 6.6% of whites between the ages of 12 and 25 sell drugs, compared to only 5% of blacks, a 32% difference. Another study by a UC Berkeley graduate student found that 1 in 3 black men will at some point in their lifetime be incarcerated, compared with 1 in 17 whites, and that African Americans will serve on average 20% longer sentences in federal prisons than their white counterparts for the same crime. Finally, in 2002, over 80% of those incarcerated under the federal crack cocaine laws were black, despite the fact that over 2/3 of crack cocaine users were actually white and Hispanic. It is evident that the black population of the United States has unjustly become the target of the drug war and of the prison industrial complex, and have been systematically pushed out of the democratic process by being subjected to a new form of racialized social control, the third manifestation of its kind in the history of the United States. This time it is not slavery or Jim Crow, but the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration. It has become quite clear that the prison industrial complex relies on the drug war, and the relationship between these two are mutual and symbiotic. The large and ever-growing number of people incarcerated because of the drug war leads to the growth of for-profit prisons, and the latter have an incentive to lobby politicians to perpetuate the drug war. While the majority of America's black and poor population at the bottom of the political, economic, and social ladder suffer, there are some at the top who benefit greatly. CCA, the largest for-profit prison company in the United States, has increased its revenues by 500% in the last 2 decades, and in 2012, the company made an offer to 48 governors to purchase and operate their state-run prisons. A clause in the offers included what is known as an occupancy requirement, which in this case demanded that the state keep those newly privatized prisons at least 90% full at all times, regardless of whether crime was rising or falling. Occupancy requirements are common practice, and as a report by the In the Public Interest found, 41 of 62 contracts for private prisons operating at the local and state level around the United States have occupancy requirements, which require the local or state governments to keep 80 to 100% of prison beds full, regardless of crime rates. CCA and the GEO Group, the giants of the prison industrial complex, are instrumental in influencing the tough-on-crime attitudes held by many in public office. And the two have not only supported laws like the 3 strikes and truth in sentencing, which have been responsible for increasing the number of individuals incarcerated, but have even helped write them. The prison industrial complex uses its enormous wealth and power to lobby and influence government to continue and strengthen tough-on-crime legislation. Between 2001 and 2012, political action committees assembled by the prison industrial complex have lobbied over $3.3 million. Between 1999 and 2009, CCA alone spent over $18 million on federal lobbying, often employing 5 or 6 firms at the same time. And between 2003 and 2011, CCA hired 199 lobbyists in 32 states, while the GEO Group hired 72 lobbyists in 17 states. Furthermore, there exists the practice of a revolving door, where individuals employed in the prison industrial complex leave to work in the government or other industries where there might exist conflicts of interest, and vice versa. Over the years, former heads of the FBI, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Secret Service, as well as a former director of the CIA, have served as directors of the GEO Group. In 1998, the Board of Governors of the GEO Group included a former former Undersecretary of the Air Force, a former Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, a former Governor of South Carolina, and a former U.S. Attorney General, in addition to others connected with a variety of military, chemical, and media firms. An egregious example of this practice was demonstrated when the former director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Harley Lappin, left his work with the government in 2011 after being arrested for alleged drunk driving, only to later find employment with CCA, serving as the company's chief corrections officer. Clearly, the conflict of interest which exists lead to an ever-increasing concentration of wealth and political power in the hands of the prison industrial complex at the expense of society in general and of African Americans in particular, indicating an erosion of democracy and democratic values. The subject of mass incarceration inside the United States, which has resulted from the war on drugs and the rise of the prison industrial complex, should be viewed as a human rights issue. There has been a successful reversal of gains made by the civil rights movement of previous decades, which has resulted in the third and current era of racialized social control in the US. Whereas in the past, African Americans were subject to horrid and forthright subjugation in the form of slavery and Jim Crow, today they face a more subtle yet equally racist phenomenon in the form of mass incarceration. Blacks in the US have been deliberately targeted by the drug war and the shift towards for-profit prisons. The prison became a business rather than a place to rehabilitate prisoners. Those incarcerated became products, and the more people imprisoned in private prisons throughout the country, the higher the revenues for these companies would be. An incentive was created based on racism and greed to lock up as many people in general, and African Americans in particular, to the extent that in a 2002 Dow Jones article, it was reported that, quote, "The private corrections industry is a safe place to lock away investments, and industry watchers predict that the prison population is set to grow due to the higher unemployment and tougher law and order policies following the September 11 terrorist attacks." This paper has demonstrated how the war on drugs and the rise of the prison industrial complex have had disastrous and racist results, being designed to subdue blacks, to unnecessarily and unjustifiably incarcerate a large number of people inside the country, with a disproportionate number of the incarcerated individuals being African American. In a country such as the United States, which prides itself on being exceptional and a shining example of human rights and democracy in the world, these inequalities shed light on the fact that the reality is quite different and that democracy still does not exist for all of its citizens. The US is indeed exceptional in one category, and that is in the number of people they lock up behind bars. Thank you.